Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 138, Meno 95c to E. Anytus had claimed that the sophists were by no means the teachers of virtue. The real teachers of virtue are decent citizens who can give advice to anyone willing to become better. But this claim was apparently refuted by demonstrating that the sons of great Athenian citizens were actually not at all virtuous. The fathers who taught their sons everything they could, or found teachers who could teach other things, couldn't find anyone who could teach their sons virtue, and they themselves didn't teach their sons virtue. After Anytus left, Socrates asked Meno not whether Thessalian citizens were incapable of teaching their sons, but whether they agreed that virtue was something teachable. Meno said that they didn't agree, and then Socrates follows that up with a return to the sophists, asking whether they agree that virtue is something teachable. And it's at that point that we learn that Gorgias himself doesn't claim to teach virtue. He even mocks those who do claim to teach virtue. And Meno has just said that the sophists as a whole sometimes appear to him and the many to be teachers of virtue, and sometimes appear not to be teachers of virtue. This is a very strange claim, because he's just said that Gorgias himself claims not to teach virtue, so he shouldn't be inconsistent. Meno should have said that there are some sophists who claim to teach virtue, as opposed to other sophists who claim that virtue is something which cannot be taught, and not that all of the sophists sometimes appear to be teachers of virtue and sometimes don't appear to be. Socrates now continues. Oithe de hoti monon soitikai tois alois tois politikois tuto doke toteben enai didakton toted u. You know that this thing seems not only to you and the other politikoi to be sometimes something teachable and sometimes not. Politikoi aren't politicians, but they are citizens who are more active in running the polis. Socrates has returned to talking about the decent citizens as opposed to the sophists, only to say that they are not the only ones who sometimes think that virtue is something teachable and sometimes not. As Socrates says, Meno and the other politikoi are not alone. Alla kai Theognin ton poieten ois hoti tauta lege. But do you know that even Theognis the poet says these same things? Theognis is a very famous and respected poet from about a century before, and he's from Megara, so he's neither Attic nor Thessalian, so he's a neutral poet, but a Dorian like Meno. Socrates is about to quote some poetry from Theognis, and this is in the form of elegiac couplets. One line is a dactylic hexameter, in other words 6 feet, each of them being da didi, or a variation thereof, and the other line following it is only 5 feet, being 2 units of 2.5 dactylic feet. The dactylic hexameter was used in the oral tradition, from which we get the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the poems of Hesiod also use that tradition, with more of an emphasis on purveying the stored wisdom of the ages. The elegiac meter is a later invention and the tradition is no longer oral as such. These poems were written down, but just like oral poetry, these elegies were intended to be sung and performed in public. One reason for mentioning Theognis at all is evidently to engage Meno's interest, which may have been flagging by this point, and Meno asks, "En poiois episin," and Socrates says, "En tois elegeois, hu lege," in which utterances? In the elegies, where he says, "Kai paratoisin pine kai estia, kai metatoisin hidze, kai handanetois hon megale dynamis, eslon men garapesla didaxeai, endekakoisin summis ges apoles, kai tone ontenon." Drink and eat among those, and sit with those, and delight those whose power is great. For you will teach yourself good things from good people. But if you mingle with bad people, you will lose even the sense you have. Ois thoti en tutois men hos didactuus estes aretes lege, fine taige. You know that in these he speaks as if virtue is something teachable, so it appears. The operative word in Theognis here is, you will teach yourself good things from good people. The manuscripts of Theognis have, you will learn good things from good people. It's very hard to see how the word mathesei could change to didaxei by mistake, and it is far more likely that Plato has doctored the source, as he so often does in dialogues. We may suppose that here Socrates isn't talking about learning, but about teaching, and for that reason he, Socrates, has changed the verb from learn to teach. We should notice that learning good things from good people is akin to what Anytus claimed, that people could receive advice from good people and become better. Teaching oneself good things from good people is a little different because it requires the student to be active. The good people are those with great power, which would please Anytus. I presume Anytus knew this verse, but Anytus didn't rely on the ability of the strangers to learn for themselves from the good citizens, but rather thought that they needed to be given advice. This is where Anytus differs from Theognis. Alternatively, Anytus has his good citizens actually teaching, giving advice, under pressure from Socrates' line of argument, in which they were talking about who teaches. If this is the case, then the quote from Theognis becomes extremely important in this dialogue, because we then have three ways of teaching. We have the sophistic way of simply passing opinions from the teacher to the student. We have Socrates, who asks questions all the time and tries to engage the student in dialectic. And then Anytus represents not another teacher who simply passes on opinions, but is a role model. This is Theognis' intent, that you should stay in the company of good people, and just by doing that you will learn good things. Theognis also provides the corollary that if you are in the company of bad people, you will lose even the sense that you already have. In other words, you become like your company. Good company makes you good, bad company makes you bad. This is an idea we see in other dialogues as well, where young people should look for role models and simply imitate them. This is one reason why Homer was so popular. The Iliad especially was so popular among aristocrats. At least Anytus and his colleagues are more appropriate role models for a modern polis rather than Achilles or Hector, who would have been too individualistic in a democratic army. The good men Theognis refers to, the ones with great power, are no longer kings, as the good men were in Mycenaean times, as reflected in the Iliad, but oligarchs, members of rich families who together formed the elite of a polis. If these are the good people, the bad people are the commoners, the ordinary people who were poor and did most of the work. Theognis is therefore advising his audience to mingle with great people, rich families, in order to learn how to become one himself, rather than mixing with the ordinary people, because this would appear to lead inevitably to one becoming common and ordinary. Given the choice, it would seem more sensible to choose to imitate the rich, and it would appear to be senseless to wish to imitate the poor. When Theognis says that mingling with the bad would lead someone to lose even the sense he had, he's not talking in philosophical terms. He's just saying that you have to be mad to want to be like the poor. Theognis then has a rather aristocratic view of life, and this is a little different from Anytus, who is, even though he's rich and powerful, is still democratic. He wouldn't say that the ordinary people in Athens are bad necessarily, simply that they are not kaloi kagathoi, the good and the fine. We'll have to wait till next time to see how Theognis contradicts himself with regard to the teachability of virtue.